Hey, what's up YouTube? Today we are going to go over two asynchronous callbacks inside of Auth, and that is going to be the JWT callback and the session callback. This will allow us to update the JSON Web Token so we can access certain custom properties we want inside of the session object using the UseSession hook. We're also going to go over the update method, which will allow us to update certain properties inside of our object. So before we get started, if you can hit that like button and also subscribe for more content, it would be greatly appreciated. Other than that, let's get to coding. So before we get started, if you do not know how to use the credentials provider or are not comfortable with it, I highly recommend checking out my latest video where I go over step by step on how to use and set up properly the credentials provider, because that is the provider I'm using in this tutorial. I'm not using the Google or GitHub provider, just the credentials provider. And what we're going to do in this video is we are going to go over asynchronous callbacks. So if we go inside of the docs, these are functions that are used to control what happens when an action is performed. We are going to go over the session function and the JWT function. This will allow us to update the JSON Web Token, and we're also going to be able to update the session inside of our client. So before we get started, let's go over quickly the two ways that we can retrieve the session object inside of our application. So if we go to our text editor, we can go inside of this server page that I created. And inside of this page, I am fetching the session object server side. So you can fetch a server side or you can fetch a client side. Fetching a server side, you must use the getServerSession and import it at the top as so. And this is from Auth. Then we have to initialize the getServerSession, and we are passing through a parameter, which is the Auth options. And this is the function that is inside of the catch-all route that is defining all of the options. Then you could console log the session, and then you should be able to see all of the session parameters that we could get, like the name, email, and image. Then we can use the UseSession hook, which is a client-side way to fetch the session. And what you have to do there is you have to create a provider, and I usually create it inside of a context directory. And this provider must use the use client directive at the top. We have to import the session provider from next-auth/react. Then we must pass in the children and session, and then we wrap all of the children inside of a session provider while passing in the session as a prop. This means after we do this in the provider file, we must go to our root layout, and then we have to wrap the whole application or the children with the provider. So we import at the top and then wrap the body with the provider. This allows us to use the UseSession hook from next-auth/react. And it has to be a use client page as well. And then we can initialize the use session by calling it data, so const data, and we usually rename it to session. And then you could also pass in a few other parameters like status and update, which we'll go over later. And this is going to equal the use session hook. And I console logged it here saying use session hook session object. And then we are just console logging the session. So let's go to our localhost 3000. That is a quick overview of the two ways to retrieve the session. So I'm going to log in with an account I already registered. And we are going to log in. It's going to push us to this dashboard page, and it's just showing my name. If we inspect the page, go to the console, open up the object, and then inside the object, we have a user object with an email, image, and name. So maybe sometimes when you're doing an application, this isn't enough information that you want to display to the user. You might want to display somebody's address. You might want to display somebody's phone number. You could display their city. You could display whatever you want. You can actually add stuff to the session object. And the only way you can do that is with the asynchronous callback functions. So before we go into depth about the callback functions, I have wrote a little few things so you could understand it better. Like I said, we are using the credentials provider, and inside of the credentials provider, you always use the authorize function. So let me just go back to the page, go to the catch-all route. And if you look right underneath the providers where we define the credentials provider, we have an asynchronous authorize function, which is a callback function, and it is specific only to the credentials provider. So what the authorize function does is what it says. It authorizes the login. So when I try to log into my application, this is where all the logic is for when somebody logs in to make sure they are authorized to log in. So that is the first function that's called off when somebody signs in. After this function is called, if you have marked your provider to use the JWT as the session, then the JWT callback function will be called. And then right after the JWT callback function is called, the session callback is called right after that. So this is the order of how the callbacks are called. And this is a very important step because that's going to help you understand on how to use these callback functions and how you could utilize it to your benefit. So the very first thing I want to show you is how you can add a property or parameter to that session object. So I want to add the address. I want to show that we can display their address as well. So we have to go to our register page where we register an account. And this is just a form with a bunch of inputs and labels. And inside the form, we make them fill out their name, email, and password. But we also want them to fill out an address. So what I'm going to do here is I am going to just copy a div down with all the inputs and labels, change the name to address, change all of this to address, and then what we're going to do here is we'll change this address as well. This is going to be data.address. And the reason why is because the state that I defined up here in the use state is the data object with a bunch of properties. And now we need to pass the address in as well. And this is going to be initial value of an empty string. So now we have an input that is fully functional working for the address. And the state we are updating as well as they type because we have an on change here as well. So when we scroll back up, when we hit that submit on the form, this register user function is called and is fetching to our backend API /register route. So what we need to do here is we need to go to this backend route because we are just passing the data, which is all the name, email, address, and password. So we're going to go to the backend register route. And now we are receiving the body from await request.json. And then I want to destructure it with name, email, address, and password. And this is going to be the body.data. I usually like console logging when we're passing information to our backend API. So we're going to add it there as well. We're going to add a part of the check as well. So if there's no address filled out on the input, we're going to throw an error. And then we have to, I'm using Prisma as the ORM. And we want to pass that to our backend as well. So it'll be the address, just like that. And then when you do this and you add a new field, you must go to your schema.prism and make sure it's updated in your user model. So I already have address here as an optional string. You could do it as a required string, doesn't matter. And then when you make a change to your Prisma schema file, make sure you run npx Prisma generate. Obviously shut off your development server before doing this. And then you can restart your development server. But since I already have it here, we don't have to do that. So let's go back to the register route. So we are now registering a user with these 4 different properties to the backend. So it's not going to update in next auth in the authorize function inside of that session object, but we are able to send it to the backend now, and we're going to be able to get that address as well. Let's test it out to make sure our register function is working completely. So to do that, we are going to go to our localhost 3000, go to the dashboard like this. We go to click the register button. And then as you can see, register for account. We could put Brett, any email you want. We could just say 134 123 Main Street, password 12345. And then we could click register. So if this is successful, it pushes us to the login page. I could check the console, and as you can see, we are getting all of the payload sent to the backend, And then we could also make sure we had a 200 status, and you could also check the database. So we could just go to mongodb.com real quick. We could sign in. And like I said, if you're not following the video I did prior to this or have your credentials provider set up, this is going to be really foreign to you. So I would definitely recommend, like I said, watching the videos on my channel in the past. So we are going to go to the next auth practice video where I keep all the collection. And I should have a user called Brett12134@gmail right here. And as you can see, everything was successful. So our register endpoint is actually working how it should. Now that we go back into our catch all route, as you can see, our authorized function is completely filled out and done with all the logic needed. And what we are doing is we are returning the user. So right below this credentials provider, outside of the providers, we need to define callbacks. And like I said, those are asynchronous callbacks that allow us to do certain actions when a certain event happens. So we're going to have the callbacks, and this is going to be an object. And like I said, we are using two callbacks. We're using the session and the JWT. The JWT gets triggered before the session, so I always like putting that first. So we're going to say async JWT. And this is going to take in the token and the user and the session. And if you do look at the docs, you could see exactly what this specific callback function takes in. So what we are going to do here is inside of the JWT, I like to console log real quick what we are getting back, and we could console log the token, user, and session. And then what we're going to do here is we are just going to close this function, and then we can put a comma. Now let's define the session function. So it's going to be an async session, and this is going to take in the session, the token, and the user. So like I showed in that specific diagram that I created about 5 minutes ago, the authorized credentials is going to get called. It's going to return a user, and then it is going to call this JWT function. And then the token is going to pass from this JWT down to the session function. And then the session allows us, this function allows us to use it on the actual application. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to console log this too. Let me just close this first. And let's console log the session callback with the session, token, and user. And then we could just return the token on the first one, because as we're returning, and then return the session on the session function as well. So now I'm going to log in with that account I just registered with. So let's go back. And I need a comma after the secret. And I actually need to close the callback. So right there, the comma. Perfect. All right, so now I'm going to sign in with that account, which is Brett134@gmail.com. And then we're going to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's the password. Enter. So now I'm on the dashboard. I successfully logged in. And I've console logged the JWT and the session function. So we're going to check it out in the console. And I'm going to explain exactly what's going on. Okay. So the authorized function called, it returned the user. And as you can see in the JWT callback, we are getting a token, and the token is showing the name, the email, the picture, and an ID. And then we are returning a user. So the JWT callback function only returns the user on sign in. It doesn't return it every time the page reloads, only when you sign in. So as you can see here, we are getting the user with the ID, the name, the email, the address, the hash password, the email verified, and the image. So we want this address, and you want the ID maybe inside of the session. So we have to pass it from the JWT function to the session function. And then if we scroll down again, the JWT callback calls again, and it passes all the information from the user to the token. So as you can see now, we have all of the information inside of the token, except for the ones that we haven't defined yet, which is the address and the ID. So as you see, address and ID aren't inside this token, but they are inside of this user. So we can move from the user to the token. The user is undefined because it only is defined when you sign in. And then the session callback gets called. So as you can see the order, JWT, then session. And the session, it shows the session. So when you console log a session, it's the name, email, and image. And then the token is so far the same token that got passed in. So like I said, we need to update the token in the JWT so the session can have the same token information as well, because that session is going to allow us to use it on the client. So to do that, we are going to work inside of the JWT token. This is where most of your logic and coding is going to be done. So inside of the JWT token, we are going to say if there's a user, so that means on sign in, there's going to be a user. So on sign in, we want to return, and what we want to do is we want to put all the information inside that token, because that token is getting passed to this asynchronous function here. So we're going to spread through all of the token data that we had that I just showed you. And then we are going to get the ID, and it's going to be from user.id. So now the token.id is going to be the user.id. So if we go back and look at it, you see the user here, it's only called. We're getting the ID from here, and we are placing it in the token here. We also want to place that address as well. So we're going to do the address, and we're getting it from the user.address. And this is storing it inside of the token because we are returning the token, as you see here. So other than that, it looks like this function is completely done, and we could retest the theory. And if it works, that means this JWT callback, the second time it's called with the user that's undefined, should have the ID and the address in it. So I'm going to go back to my localhost 3000, sign out, go back. We're going to log in with the same information. Brett134, password 12345. We're going to sign in. Okay, when we sign in, we're going to get the consoles again, and we're going to get a user since we just signed in. So we are going to scroll down below and we're started, which is right here. So we get the token, and we get, where is it? Here it is, right here. Okay. So the JWT callback is called. We get the token, which we console log here. We get the user, which we console logged again. And now we are passing the user ID and the user address into the token. So now we should have the ID and address inside of the JWT callback token, which, as you can see right here, we have a token inside of the JWT callback, and we have the ID and address as well. So that means this token now can be passed into the session, which it does by default. And if we go to the session, we also have the ID and address. And this ID is the MongoDB ID, and that's how we could hook up different posts to a specific user. And it's very useful passing the ID to the session. So now we have this token, and now we can actually pass this information from the token into the session, but we have to do a few things inside the session before we could actually access that onto our client. So now that we successfully passed information into our token with this logic here, which I'll just write a comment real quick, pass in user ID and address to token. So that's what this does here, and then we return it. Then we get the token here. And then what we need to do here is we need to return the session spread. So everything in the session, And if you want to look at whatever it is, the session is called right here, which is the name, email, and image. So the name, email, and image, and then we're doing a comma. And then we need to define the user because it's going to be inside the user object. We are going to spread out throughout the session.user. And then we are going to pass the ID, which is the token.id. And then we're going to pass in the address, which is the token.address. And then we could just close this with a semicolon here. And then what I can put above this return is a comment saying pass in user ID and address to the session. Perfect. So now we should be able to access the ID and address inside of the console as long as we're using the UseSession hook. Let me stop the server, run the server again, open up localhost 3000, and then we're going to check the console to make sure we have the address and ID. And if we do, that means we successfully added a custom property to our session object. So we're going to log in. Same email. So after we log in, we could check the console and see if we have those properties. So I'm going to open it bigger, moment of truth. And as you can see, instead of just the name, image, and email, we get the address and ID as well. And now that means we could display the address on the dashboard. So now we successfully have integrated different properties into the session object. This is how you do it, by using the power of the session asynchronous function and also the JWT asynchronous function. So the next thing I want to go over that is very powerful too, if you look inside of the docs, we will go to the client API folder. And if you scroll down inside of the UseSession hook, we can expose an update method. This allows us to update the session. Like say if we want to change my name from Brett to Mike, we can do that by using the update method. And we have to use these update method inside of the session and JWT asynchronous function. To use the update method inside of these callback functions, we need to pass in the trigger. So trigger is another property we could pass into the JWT. And then you could also pass trigger in a session, but we aren't going to do that because we're using the JWT as the session. So what we are going to do is we have to have another if statement like this. So right above that, we could say if trigger equals update. That means we are using the update method. And then we're also going to change the name. So we're going to say if the session dot name is different, we are going to run this block of code. And what we are going to do here is we are just going to change the token.name to the session.name. So we haven't been able to change the session.name yet. So if you run this code now, the name is going to be the same name because you haven't changed it. So what we need to do is inside of the dashboard, right below where we say hi and whatever the session user's name is, we can actually have a label, and this label could say update name, and then we can have an input. So whatever we type in this input, that is going to be our new name. So we're going to say type equals text. We can have a placeholder, which is going to be enter new name. And then we need some state. So we already have the useState imported at the top. And as you can see here, I already have it initialized as the new name and set new name. So the value is going to be new name. And you can name these state whatever you want. I'm just naming it new name. And then the onChange is going to be an anonymous function. And this is going to set the new name to the e.target.value. So whatever they type. And then the only thing that won't work is if you try to wrap this in a form. You cannot wrap this in a form. I don't know why it doesn't work, but it just doesn't. So right below this, I'm going to have a button. And if you do look at the docs, they do use a button as well. So in the button, I am just going to add a class name real quick in some other code that I have. And I'm just going to say update. That's going to be the name of the button. That's what it's going to say. And we are going to have an onClick property on here as well. So let's have an onClick. And this onClick is going to be an anonymous function. And it is going to call the update method like this. And where we're getting an update method is from this UseSession hook. As you see here, I have it passed in as update, and you could also do status. Status is totally different, has nothing to do with this. Status has 3 different forms. It's like authenticated, not authenticated, and something else. But we are just using the update method that we get from the UseSession hook. And what we're going to do is we are going to pass in an object because we want to change the name. So we're going to change the name to the new name, just like that. So now we could type in the input, and we should be able to change the session name to a new name of whatever we typed in. And then what we do here is, since we aren't done with the backend code, the new session name is going to equal the new token.name. That means that the token.name is going to be returned as the token, and it's going to pass in here the session as the new name. And that means we need to update this as well. So what we're going to say is name is going to equal whatever the token.name is. And that token.name is obviously going to be passed from the JWT callback. So let's do that, and then I'm going to show you guys how to push this new name change to your MongoDB database. So let's test it out real quick to make sure. So let's go to our localhost 3000. As you can see, we have update name, enter new name, and then we click update. When we enter the new name, this name should change instantaneous pretty much. So like I said, we could change it to Mike, update, and now it says hi Mike. We console log it, we look at the object, and the new name is Mike. But if you don't update the database that you have, if you sign out, so for example, I sign out, try to log back in. So let me log back in with the same email. And then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's going to say Brett. So hi, Brett. So we need to update the database if we change the name. So to do that, inside of the JWT callback function, we can update the database by using a Prism method. So what we could do is right below this logic here, I'm just going to put a comment saying update the user in the database. Spread it out a little bit. And then what we're going to say here is we're going to say const new user. You can name whatever you want. It's going to equal await. And then we are going to update the user by using the update method of Prism. And then we are going to find the ID, which is the token ID, which is technically the MongoDB ID that we got from earlier. So that is a unique identifier that we can use. And then what we can do is we can update the data, and we're going to update the name, which is going to be the token.name. So if the token.name changes, it's going to be the token.name. If it doesn't change, then it's just going to be the same name. So that's why we're doing it exactly like that. And then let's close this whole new user function. And then right below that, we can actually console.log the new user. So this is going to pop up in our console here. And then when we console log this, this should be the new name, which I'll type as Mike. So now we go back to our localhost 3000. We can refresh the page. We get Brett. So now we type Mike, update, we get Mike. So now let's check our log real quick. Let's make this bigger. And we are looking for the new user because that's what we named it. And as you can see, the new user is here, and we get the name as Mike, and all the other information stays the same. So let's check the database to see if Mike got updated to our user as well. So if we refresh this page, check out our entry inside of our collection, and as you can see right here, the new name is Mike, and the email and address and hash password are still the same. So you can update any property you want inside of your session object. I just happen to do the name for this example, and that is exactly how you use the update method. That is how you use the asynchronous JWT function callback and the session function callback while using the credentials provider. If you are using the Google provider or any other provider, the method will be a little different. So I only recommend using the credentials provider if you're following this tutorial. And I do want to show you, if I do sign out, go back and log in, it's going to say Mike. So we're going to log in. Same account. And it says Mike. So that is how you successfully use the asynchronous callbacks with the update method. If you do have any questions, I know it is a hard subject to wrap your brain around. Leave a comment below or join my Discord room where I'll be able to answer you quicker. But other than that, if you've gained any value of this or learned a lot, please hit that like button and also subscribe for more content just like this.